we're really privileged to have Senator Portman from Ohio who's joined us. He and I served in the House together. He is a man for all seasons. He comes from a family that was oriented to small business. His father was a successful small businessman. I think you were, as a young man, as a child, involved in making that business operate. Rob is a conservationist. He's a kayaker of some renown. He paddled the length of the Mississippi at one point, right? The Rio Grande. Well, we want to paddle the length of the Mississippi. He served in the House when I did, as I mentioned. He was also the United States Trade Representative, so we might ask him about Korea and Colombia and Panama, those trade agreements, and get his point of view. He's a green eyeshade guy. He was the head of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which is a powerful, powerful arm of the executive branch. He's close to the Bush family. He has an unusual, probably unique set of experiences. He played in the preparation for the debates in the presidential cycles in 2000, 2004, the following group of people: Joe Lieberman, John Edwards, which he's really proud of that assignment, Hillary Clinton, and President Obama. Is that right? And Al Gore. So he is a talented man. He's a good friend, and he and I have sons who are both Jeds, along with other things that we share in common. So give Senator Portman a big round of applause and a welcome. Let's have some fun.
Well, it's great to be here to talk to a bunch of Coloradans, and I can tell you I wish we were in your state right now, although it's kind of a Colorado day here today. You know, if you were here last week, you would know what real Washington summers are like. But it's neat to be here to talk a little about some of the issues, but also to talk a little about my friend Mark Udall. I noticed that he's on the Energy Committee with me, where he focuses a lot on this balance between being sure we are both using more of our own energy and also to be sure that we were focusing on efficiency and conservation and the environment. So he's kind of like, you know, the guy in the middle often. And I don't know if he likes me saying that or not, but I think it's really important to have some people who believe in using our energy we have here, but also focusing on how to use less of it through efficiency and conservation. And then on the Armed Services Committee, where we just left, we're in a markup right now, meaning we're writing the legislation for the year for DOD. He's got a lot of experience and background, and he's also on the Intelligence Committee, so he has some special insights on the defense side, which are helpful. But then the final committee, which actually makes all the sense in the world, I hadn't realized it till today, he's on the Aging Committee. And, I mean, look at him. A couple years ago, he had dark hair, and he is definitely aging. And I think that's an appropriate reason for him to be on that committee. But he's still young at heart. He still climbs mountains and does all these crazy things. But he's you know, one of these sensible legislators up here who can form bipartisan groups and get things done. As a Republican, I worked with him on the House side when I was there, and now I'm enjoying doing it on the Senate side. I just got elected in 2010, so I'm new over here on the Senate side. I thought I was done with politics a few years ago when I left the Bush administration as the director of the Department of the Budget and Management, which is the worst job in government, OMB. You have to say no to everybody, which is actually sort of fun. But given the budget crisis we face as a country, you know, it's a good time to be here in the Senate talking about these issues, trying to get the deficit and debt under control and grow our economy, which is the key, in my view. The two of them are related. You've got to get the budget deficit under control, in part by growing the economy, in part by cuts. We need to restrain the spending, but we also have got to have more revenue coming in. And the way to get more revenue coming in is not to raise taxes on businesses. In fact, it's to grow the economy through some sensible things, some of which Mark has been very supportive of. We talked about a moment ago on the energy front, but also regulatory relief that he's also supportive of. Tax reform, getting rid of incredible complications and administrative costs in our tax code and all the bad decision-making that's made because of it. Every economist will tell you, right, left, or center, we can have a more efficient tax code to grow our economy and make us more competitive globally. Dealing with our workforce issues, you know, the federal government spends a lot of money in Colorado and in Ohio with worker retraining programs, many of which don't work. We're not connecting people to business and to jobs, and some of you here probably work closely with some of these programs. I assume at Mesa, you know, Tim, you probably worked with some of those programs, and, you know, they're important programs, but we got to figure out a way to be sure the programs are targeted toward actually creating the kind of skill sets that are needed in the community. And unfortunately, it's not happening sometimes today. We are in a situation we can't afford that anymore. We need to, in a global competitive environment that we're in, we've got to do everything right. Our legal system, in my view, is badly in need of reform. So between regulations and taxes and energy, legal system, worker retraining, lots of issues, but also lots of opportunity. And I think America's best days can still be ahead of us as long as we make these changes. And some of these are big structural changes, but they've got to be made if we're going to be competitive and begin to create more opportunity for those coming generations so that we can pass on to our kids and grandkids what our parents and grandparents passed on to us. I think we're at a sort of tipping point here. And one key to this is to find how to work together across the aisle, finding common ground. Compromise is a dirty word. A better word is let's set an objective, a goal together, and let's work together to achieve that and take partisan politics out of it. If we do that, we can make amazing progress. If we don't, going into the 2012 election, I fear that over the next 18 months we could have some real problems, including the potential of a debt crisis, where people finally say, you know what, gee, it looks like America's more like Greece than it is like the old America where the full faith and credit of the federal government was something you could really trust. So I think we're at a point where we have to, on an urgent basis, figure out how to solve some of these problems. Hopefully we'll be doing that some with this debt limit discussion. Some of you have followed this, but by sometime in early August, the federal government's telling us that we have to tell the federal government that their credit card needs to be increased. Otherwise, the federal government can't borrow anymore. And when your spouse tells you it's time for the credit card to be increased, you probably say, well, gee, that's a good idea, but maybe we should look at the underlying problem. Why do we keep needing to borrow more? So I'm hoping that we can do two things in this context. One is restraining some spending so we don't keep getting ourselves back into this problem with record deficits, record debts, our debt now. If you look at the gross debt, including the Social Security debt, it's the size of our economy. So it's 100% of our economy. Think about that. Historically, it's been 37, 38, 40%. Greece, by the way, when they hit 100% is when they had their problems. They're now over 100%. But Portugal and Spain, Ireland, some of these other countries are about where we are, about 100%. And so we need to deal with these issues. And then second, again, on the growth agenda, we need to put in place, start the ball rolling on some of these pro-growth initiatives, on regulatory relief, on tax reform, on a better energy policy that gets us away from our dangerous dependency on foreign oil and the kind of $4 gas we've seen that's put a big crimp on our economy. So we've got some challenges, but we've also got, I think, some great opportunities and potential for us to do things on a bipartisan basis that kind of pulls some politics out and makes it happen. And there's nobody better situated, given his experience and his committees and so on, to help do that than this gentleman here who's on the Aging Committee. Anyway, with that, if we could, I would love to get a little input from you all. We got some people in the room here who are community leaders in every respect, educational leaders, business leaders, and others. If I could hear a little bit from you as to what you see going on in Colorado. Maybe I'm wrong about the economy. Maybe you see things picking up out there. I'd love to hear that, and maybe get a little dialogue. Yes, ma'am.
So I have a question for you. I worked for MCI and WorldCom, and then Bernie Evers took my 401k and turned it into toilet paper. And now I work for Verizon, just through, mergers, et cetera. And, about 5 years ago, I had a,
You're my carrier.
I don't carry them, but.
I carry you, though. You're my carrier, so, yeah. Oh, my God. Hope your boss isn't in the room.
The thing with Verizon now is that, the group that I worked in had over 150 people 3 or 4 years ago. Today we have 7 in my group. And everything is getting offshore. Those people that lost their jobs in Colorado still can't find jobs. Everything's going offshore at $8 an hour. I mean, how do we compete with that? And I think Verizon doesn't really have much of a choice because of the economy, but yet, again, I can't compete with $8 an hour.
Can I back up, mention something else that you talked about on your 401k that became a 201k, or it sounds like a 101k if you were with WorldCom stock, but if you have a 401k, diversify. I mean, it's your money, it's your decision. And one thing that Congress has done over the last 10 years is allowed people to put more in their 401k, to use catch-up contributions, to encourage diversification by forcing companies to provide notice of what your investments are in, and if you're in the stock of the company you work for, to send a notice out saying you ought to diversify. So I know you learned that lesson the hard way, and I'm sure the company was encouraging you, and you wanted to be part of the team and all that. But I was in the House along with a Democrat named Ben Cardin, the leader on this issue and passing legislation. And 401ks are great, but you've got to have diversification. And by the way, because of all those changes where we increase limits and so on, a lot more people now do have some retirement savings. Trillions of more dollars have been put aside, and that's good. We need more savings in this country. On the issue of outsourcing, it's very difficult issue, particularly for the kind of jobs that can be outsourced at $8 an hour. The ultimate answer is to have a more competitive economy here. And in Ohio right now, we're insourcing some jobs. We're outsourcing others, I'm sure. But the kind of jobs we're insourcing is, one, some of the call centers, actually because they had some complications of doing business overseas. Some of the companies, one of which happens to be headquartered in my hometown, is actually bringing some jobs back. Frankly, they're going to be doing it with fewer people because of the way they do the phone trees and so on now. They can figure out how to do it more efficiently. That's part of it. They got more efficient doing it here. But second, it's just reliability and so on. Also, there's inflation over there. So China, India, places like that are seeing both higher rates of pay, which is going to happen as the economies, become more balanced. We're still way ahead of them in terms of our per capita income and so on, but they're starting to grow, and they have inflation. The second is we're insourcing some work on the manufacturing side because the value of the dollar has gone down, which is a mixed blessing because it indicates something about our economy that's not necessarily positive, but it makes it more affordable for us to be able to send our stuff overseas rather than to make it overseas and send it back here. I guess the answer would be we can't put our head in the sand. That doesn't work. Other countries have tried that. Some would argue that's Smoot-Hawley and how we get into our problems in the Great Depression. You look at South Korea and North Korea. North Korea did it all internally. South Korea looked out. One became, the best example in the world of a country that really went to development. The other, North Korea, is a basket case. So it's good to be in trade, but it's got to be fair. You've got to have a level playing field in terms of the trade distortions, and you've got to have a competitive economy. And this is what I was talking about earlier. We can't afford to sit back anymore and just allow all these inefficient systems to dictate, how our economy works. We have a lot of costs built in. Healthcare is another one. I didn't mention it because, Mark and I have some differences maybe on this issue. I didn't want to get into them, but I'll get into them. But we've got to get our healthcare cost system down. And that's part of, what you're talking about. One reason you do outsourcing is because of healthcare costs these days, because other countries do not, even developed countries, have half the cost of healthcare that we do. So if you're a business that wants to provide healthcare, and I assume you all do, your costs are going up. 9% per year is the average this year on the private sector. That's killer. So we didn't do that in that legislation. So I know it's tough and there'll be dislocations, but the answer is, in my view, having a more competitive economy, smart trade laws. Now, that's not really trade of people because outsourcing is different than goods and services, but and in the end, we can compete. And again, I see in Ohio that we've got some work actually coming back now. Maybe Verizon will figure that out. Yes, sir.
You talked about the importance of dealing with the long-term deficit and cutting across the board, putting all the entitlements and defense into the equation certainly helps. But all the economists that I've read say we're going to have to do something on the revenue side too. And just assuming that the economy is going to grow is wishful thinking to cover that gap. They talk about different ways of getting more revenue. I know we don't like the word tax increase, but do you see, how do you see balancing the books? How do you see projecting out that reversal that we all need without doing tax increases? Or maybe you think tax increases are just going to have to be part of the equation?
Well, first of all, I think you're right about sort of everything being on the table. I would disagree a little on across-the-board cuts because I think there's smarter ways to do it. I think there need to be caps, and in a sense that's across the board because if you bump up against the caps, there needs to be some enforcement, which should be a sequestration, meaning basically you reduce the spending. But we should be able, to my point earlier about the bipartisanship, we should be able on a smart basis to go into these programs and reduce the ones that aren't working as well. Maybe ones that are working really well, that you need for your seed corn, for research, for instance, and technology and so on, even increase some of those, and we have to deal with the entitlement programs, otherwise they'll gobble up the entire budget within the space of a couple decades. I mean, you look at the numbers, they're frightening. And this goes to healthcare costs we talked about earlier, because Medicaid and Medicare are driven in large measure by healthcare costs. So just with that caveat, I agree with you on the spending side. We've got to restrain the spending. By the way, don't have my dandy charts here, and I carry charts around with me now, but on the budget side, 60% of our budget is now interest on the debt and the mandatory spending, or so-called entitlement programs. As recently as 1965, it was 25%, and that's the fastest growing part of the budget. So we have to deal with that. On the revenue side, our revenues are relatively low now. It's a function, in part, of the fact that our economy's still incredibly weak, and we saw the growth numbers from last quarter, which were really disappointing. Saw the jobs numbers from last month, which are back up over 9%. No wonder. But on the revenue side, I guess what I would say is the first thing we've got to do, and the fiscal commission that the president appointed took this general approach. Look at the tax code and listen to all the smart economists as to how the best way is to reform it, simplify it, make it more pro-growth. And let's see what growth we can get out of that. Now, some would call that tax increases because there'll be more revenue coming in. But I would actually say in most areas you want to lower the rates and get rid of the deductions and preferences, exclusions, credits, and so on. Mark talked a little earlier about the ethanol provision. And although I voted against the specific bill he was talking about, I do believe that we've got to phase out, and I mean phase out, this ethanol subsidy, because it's in my view, it's spending within the tax code. And it leads to decision-making that's not based on the economics and the free market, but a subsidy with the government picking and choosing. So I think that's the better way to do it, and I think there's lots of room for it. In fact, the President's Fiscal Commission came out with a proposal. I don't agree with all that, but it was that general approach. Senator Wyden, who's a Democrat from Oregon, along with Senator Coates, a Republican from Indiana, have a proposal out there similar to that. I know that in the Ryan budget, he doesn't give any details, but he talks about 25% rates on corporate and individual, with getting rid of deductions to make that up. So I think that's the direction we ought to be going. Some of you in here probably support the fair tax or the flat tax or even more radical tax changes. Some of those might make sense, but at a minimum, let's go back to what we did in '86, lower those rates, get rid of a lot of this stuff that's built up in the code, and make the code more economically efficient. As I said earlier, economists across the spectrum will tell you that that's a way to get the revenues up by growing the economy, which is the right way to do it. Yes, ma'am.
I'd kind of like to go back to talking a little bit about trade. We recently did a roundtable. I work for Chamber of Commerce in Grand Junction, and we recently did a roundtable, and we've got manufacturers who really do want to be creating jobs, and with the value of the dollar, are finding they're fairly attractively priced in a global marketplace, but we're running up against issues around trade and trade agreements and all of those sorts of things. So could you address that just a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is trade is up 15% in this first quarter. The bad news is that we're losing out as Americans because we're not aggressively opening up markets for our products, our farmers, our workers, our service providers, and the rest of the world is. And the reason is the United States is not negotiating new agreements. We've done these 3 agreements, Panama, Colombia, and Korea you've heard about, but frankly, we completed those 3 and 4 years ago. I mean, I was the trade representative and we completed Colombia. I thought we were all done 4 years ago. And here we are, still not having this agreement up on the Hill. The former president sent it up in 2007. Congress rejected it. This new Congress is more receptive to it, but this administration hasn't sent it up yet. They keep saying they're going to. But look, it's a pretty simple proposition. We have a relatively open economy in this country. We're not free of all protectionism. We have some tariffs, and we have some protectionism, but we are, relative to the rest of the world, a big, free, open economy. And what we go to other countries and say is, if you want to deal with us with a trade agreement, you've got to lower your tariffs like we've got ours. And this means lowering them down to 0 over time. And it's worked for us. 41% of our exports go to only 10% of the world. Think about that. That 10% of the world is countries we have free trade agreements with. We don't have a free trade agreement with China or Europe. We do have one with countries like Chile or Australia or Singapore, Canada, Mexico, and that's where we send our exports for the most part, is to those countries. or 41% of our exports, which is way out of proportion to it's actually about 7% of the world economy. So I'm a supporter generally of these trade agreements. Now, not all of them are perfect, and there's some that can be adjusted. But these three that are up right now, I hope you're getting some information on them while you're here. They are commercially excellent for the United States of America, and they also all have foreign policy applications, because if you're Colombia, you're our best ally in Latin America, and you've been told for 4 years, we're about to do this agreement, they're getting pretty frustrated with us. On July 1st, the Canadians will complete their agreement with Colombia, and guess what? They're going to take a bunch of our wheat market that should be supplied by Colorado wheat farmers. It's crazy. We had 71% of the corn, wheat, soybean market in Colombia when we completed the negotiations 4 years ago. Today, because they have in the meantime established relationships not just with Canada, but also a free trade agreement with the Mercosur countries, including Argentina, now we have 26% of that market. And so we are losing out as Americans. And this is part of, I know it's not politically popular to talk about trade. The unions are dead set against it for the most part, although the UAW is supporting the Korea agreement, for instance, because they get it. This is going to be good for them to sell more cars there. But we've got to get out of this mentality that trade is bad. Trade needs to be fair. We need to be much tougher on enforcement. I'm for taking China on, for instance, on its currency and so on. But we cannot put our head in the sand and not engage, because other countries get it. Japan and Germany and Brazil and India and China, of course, they're taking our markets away because our officials aren't out there opening up markets for our products. We have not given the president the ability to do that. It's called Trade Promotion Authority, because it's so politically hard to get that through here in the Congress. So again, I know this is a tough issue politically, but it's the right thing to do for our workers and for our farmers and our service providers in a global economy. I don't think we can get off the world. You know, we're in a global economy. We've got to roll up our sleeves and compete, and if we do, I believe we can win, and I think there's plenty of evidence of that, with bumps along the road, which there will be. So I hope you all keep plugging away on this and tell your representatives. I shouldn't be lobbying here, should I? But you know, just take a look at the numbers. The administration says we'll create 250,000 new jobs just with these three trade agreements. The Chamber of Commerce tells us it's 380,000 jobs. What would be lost if we don't do them? That's a lot of jobs right now. We could use those jobs. And then we need to go beyond and give the president the authority to negotiate. And as a Republican, I think we got to give it to President Obama. Yes? Good.
My name's Ellen Stein. I work in community radio in Durango, Colorado.
Ellen?
I read a statistic somewhere that 70% of our economic growth is driven by consumer spending. And I just have a few observations that I want to present. And Senator or Congressman Chaffetz suggested that TARP failed. We saved the banks for the meantime and the auto industry. I'm curious about your thoughts on economic recovery as it relates to what else can be done for people that are unemployed, that are facing foreclosures, in the face of this statistic that 70% of economic growth is driven by consumer spending. These people don't have jobs, they can't spend. I don't think that's a sustainable figure anyway. Business and government should be making up a greater portion of that. And then also, these people don't have health insurance at the same time that they have lost their jobs, nor do they probably have 401ks. So they're a whole different set of issues with a good millions of people in our country right now. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious what you might.
Some of them do have 401ks, but they've borrowed against their 401ks. And the numbers there are pretty dramatic among the unemployed. And the other statistic that you didn't mention, but I know you're aware of, and is a frightening one, is that more people have been unemployed for 6 months or more as a percent than any time since we started keeping these statistics. So that means that it's not just that people are unemployed, but they've been unemployed for a relatively long time, and that means there's a skills gap. And often there is a resume gap that just makes it harder to get a job, even if you have the skills. So it's a pretty misleading number to just say 9.1%, because it's a 9.1%, but a lot of people who've been out for a long time. And then there's another group, because of this long-term unemployment who have simply stopped looking for work, and then another group that they call chronically unemployed, and that gets you to about 15 or 16%, the so-called U16 unemployment number. So you think about it, that's 15% is incredibly high number, and getting close to, I guess, where they were coming out of the Great Depression with 16, 17% unemployment. So it's a huge problem. Look, I think, as I said earlier, there should be an urgency about this, almost a revolutionary approach on how do we stimulate the economy, and part of it has to come on the demand side, as you say. The president has put in place this payroll tax reduction for that reason. It hasn't worked at this point. I supported that, but I also supported providing the payroll tax deduction to small businesses for themselves. There's some here in this room who will tell you if they had a little more capital, they could invest more in their business and be able to hire some people. Because when you don't have the consumer, that's the domino is getting down to that small business. They need a little help too. So I think it would have been more effective, and the economists tend to agree with that on the analysis, and that could still be done. The president's been talking about that. That would give our economy a shot in the arm short term. But I do think we've got to deal with all these longer term problems. The uncertainty out there that's not leading to private investment, that's not leading to jobs, is driven in part by what's going on here in Washington. There's a great deal of uncertainty. People say there's, a couple $1 trillion sitting in the sidelines right now, so that companies have money, but they're not investing it in creating jobs, which then creates the income, which then creates that demand you're talking about. And it's because the debt and deficit is at historic levels and worrisome levels. And, some of the business people in this room ought to speak up. Tell me what you think, but I hear this every week when I go home. I'll be in Cleveland, Ohio tomorrow, and I'll hear it again. And it's the regulations, and it's the taxes, and it's the healthcare costs, and it's the energy costs. People who are paying $4 a gallon for gas are less likely to go out and buy, an appliance. I mean, they're just worried. So I think these are all related. So there's some short-term things we can do, but we can't ignore these structural problems and hope to get this economy back on the right track, in my view. Yes. Okay, good. Yes, sir.
Shift subjects here. I hear everybody saying they need more time, they'd like to have more time interfacing with each other, running back and forth. And yet I've sat next to a senator or representative recently at events, and they all say they're spending 50% of their time running for election. Is there anything discussion about election reform?
Yeah, I mean, you probably sat next to a House member, having been in the House for 12 years. It's tough every 2 years. I mean, basically you get elected, and a couple months later someone comes to you and says, guess what, got to start running for election again. 6 years is different, and I think Mark can attest to that. Not that Colorado or Ohio are easy states to run, because they're both sort of swing states. But I do think 2 years is awfully short. There have been discussions out there to take it to 3 years, and 4 years, and then there's also discussions of the presidency being 1 6-year term, same sort of thing. President gets elected, pretty soon, he or she's into a re-election mode. I don't know where it goes, because it requires a constitutional change, and I think it probably is unlikely, because it would take a 2/3 vote of the House, 38 states to ratify, or a constitutional convention, and those are tough to do. And a lot of people who like having their representatives get elected every 2 years, because there's a ability to keep them on a short leash. But it is a problem. Fundraising's another problem. Again, I'm blessed because I just got elected, so I don't spend that kind of time fundraising or worrying about my election efforts. But as you get closer to it, it's just a reality of the system, and it does make it harder to legislate. I think, though, ultimately, it's about people like yourself speaking up and saying what you want your legislators to do, and not to be presumptuous here, but I assume you would like to see people working together to get things done. And you may have differences of opinion across a wide spectrum as to what that is, but I think we can agree, as I said earlier, on some goals, and then work toward the objectives. I think everybody here would like to see more regulatory relief, or at least regulations that go through cost-benefit analysis, where you have the least burdensome alternative chosen. That's not done today. Where you look at the impact on jobs. I think you'd like to see tax reform that actually is not so costly and inefficient, and I assume you'd like to see us expand more exports, because that creates jobs, but also be tougher on enforcement. I mean, there's some things where I think there's more consensus than the politicians in Washington realize, and yet sometimes we just hear from one extreme or another. And folks in the middle tend to, not even in the middle politically, but folks who believe that we ought to focus on results tend to be a little more quiet. So the fact that you're here means you probably are in the camp of people who are informed and probably are looking for some results. So that may be even more effective than trying to change the Constitution. Thank you all very much.